All right. Hi. So I am Asha MacDonald, and I am here today with my dad, who is going to be talking to us about his part in perfecting the modern day barcode and scanner. So, Daddy, introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Battelle Murthy. People call me Murth. And I was Vice President of Engineering at Pitney Bowes Alpex when this whole barcode system started really. Okay, let me start right at the beginning there, and I'm going back to the time period of 69, 70, 1969, 70, that period of time, when the grocery stores at the time were starting to get very, very long lines because they were all mechanical cash register based. And so also electronics was coming in hot and heavy. And so a lot of companies had already started switching to electronics from mechanical devices like cash registers and typewriters and just adding machines. So the grocery chains were starting to get a little worried because at that time, they really didn't know much about electronics. And so for them to switch from mechanical to electronic was quite a big task. So they all got together and they said, you know what, we really have to do something. But we really don't know much about electronics. What is it that we do?
So, was this the National Association of Food Chains?
Correct.
That...
Yeah. And it was a collection of all of them.
Right,
correct.
Okay.
And so what they decided is someone advised them, look, your best bet is to hire a consultant who will a consulting company that's well versed in this kind of conversions and things like that, and they're all also experts in that. And so why don't you do that and go by their advice? I don't quite remember which company it was, but they did that. And one of the first things that the consulting company did was they wrote a specification of, which was quite thick and very detailed, as to what the Grocery Association, should do, and here's what they should ask for. And one of the other things they said also in their advice was the moment you say, we're going to go electronics and we need some way of reading the product code and things like that, you're going to get a ton of small companies saying, use our code, use our device, use our method, and you're going to be swamped by that.
Right.
So what they advised was, you have to establish that there has to be a stature of a company before they can attempt to be part of this.
Right.
And you should really run it like a contest where, first of all, the company has the wherewithal from a sales point of view to be able to research and develop a system, not just a code, but a complete system that will handle everything all the way from the conveyor belts to the cash register to the product scanning and all of that. And also they stipulated that whoever qualifies for this has to do the research and development of their own.
Right. With
And
no compensation.
With no compensation, and they have to spend their own money.
Right.
And in the end, the association, will decide with some experts as to whose system they are going to adopt for the future.
For this entire
Which also meant
grocery chain.
that if you competed and your system did not win, you lost that money that you spent on it.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was very high stake stuff. it was also very high level secrecy because one company didn't want to, the secrecy of the methods that they were going to use in the
Right.
system, all of that became
Nobody
very, very
wanted
important.
their invention to be known because then
Exactly.
somebody could steal part of it or some of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
Make it their
so
own.
security was very, very high. Anyway, to make a long story short, only about a half a dozen companies actually qualified to be part of this contest, if you will. Okay. Of course, there were companies like IBM, Pitney Bowes, National Cash Register, Burroughs Corporate, and so on.
Right.
Okay.
So of course,
Go ahead.
there's lots of stories about the barcode out there, the universal product code, the scanning. Obviously, I'm on Google right now, and there's a article here that says request went to Singer, National Cash Register, Littleton Industries, RCA, Pitney Bowes, which is who you
Which is
work
where
for,
I was, yeah.
and IBM, and there's lots of IBM stories out there, but not so much Pitney Bowes, and so this is kind of the Pitney Bowes side of the story. So
Right. So at that time, so that was really the beginning of the whole thing. Okay. And so they basically said, look, you have exactly 1 year from start to finish for you to develop, create all of that of a system for grocery chains. But one of the things they also, the consulting company had advised was, this is not just for grocery chains. This has to, we are going to, the grocers who are conducting this competition, if you will open this up to the whole world for other companies to start to use this in any which way they want to identify products. There was even an example that the consultant said that it should even be able to scan a passing train with barcodes on each one.
on each of the cars.
Each of the,
Yeah.
and remind you, at that time, the barcode itself was not, they didn't say which code to use. And so barcode was adapted much later on.
Right.
And at the same time, let me mention a very important point. The concept of using a bar, a skinny bar and a wide bar, was fairly old. It was invented in the early 1930s. It was just the concept of saying, here's how we can depict ones and zeros
Numbers.
that could be used in computers and so on, and that's all. And at that time, none of the other disciplines were available to be for the barcode to be used at all.
Right. So that's kind of the bullseye code was the first to come out, and then somebody went and
Right.
straightened it out, and there's many different
And then
versions
many
of
versions
that,
came in.
of
yeah.
having a bar equate to a number. And,
Correct.
But no way for it to mean anything.
That's exactly right. And as a matter of fact, that circular code, or bullseye code as it was called, was one of the first ones, even we checked it out. But one of the requirements of in the specification was that the bar, the code or a set of, was of course all set of numbers. That had to be, you had to be able to make it anyway such that it can be expanded. In other words, you can start with 4 numbers, but it should also be able to handle 10 numbers, 20 numbers,
Right.
100 numbers, a string of numbers, basically,
Right.
is basically what it was. So very quickly, the circular code or the bullseye code, it was very obvious that it was not possible at all, because it would just grow and grow in size to the point where if you had 100 numbers, you could not use it at
Couldn't
all.
do it. Okay.
And so there were all kinds of other things there. So it was quite apparent that almost every one of these that was competing was going to use the bar as a as part of the code.
Sort of a
So
starting
the barcode was was pretty much, it was known by everybody.
Right.
That's what they were going to adopt.
Right. So,
But how you read the code, how you handle it was not known yet.
right. So when you say the barcode, it's really just the bar format of a code. So
And the code being that a wide bar or a wide black bar
Mhm.
and a skinny black bar.
Mhm.
These are the two. So the wide one would be considered a one in the computer language, binary language,
Right.
and the skinny one would be considered a zero.
Right.
And the way we would do that is, if you had a set of bars, you would compare the bars with each other and then decide which is a zero and which is a one. In other words, which is a wide one and which is a, by comparing them with each other.
Sure. Okay. Okay.
What is not that evident, and this is kind of, most people think, okay, so there are bars there.
Right.
But in between two black bars is also a white bar.
A space.
That
Okay.
is also a bar,
Right. Right.
okay? So that's a very important
No,
thing,
see, I
because
didn't know
later
that.
on it becomes important as to how the whole thing
Right.
was conceived and adapted and developed.
Right. Right.
So we were at this point where they said, okay, you got 1 year from start to finish, and you have to give us the complete system, all the way from conveyors to cash registers to. So one of the items there was not only how to read the bar, but also the cash register itself.
Of course. Yeah.
And mind you, at that time, there were no computer chips
Right.
as we know them today.
Right.
Okay? As a matter of fact, the very first computer chip was made in a tiny little can by Fairchild Semiconductor Company. And it was actually the very first computer. And for those of you who are technical, this will be very interesting to know that it was a 4-bit computer chip. So you can see, and a 4 bits can only count up to 16.
Right. So
And
how many?
it
So
is.
So your
it's
watch
amazing.
right now
My
has-
watch probably had 1,000 times that.
right.
In terms of where we are today compared to at that time. Yeah, I'm talking early 70s now,
Right.
71, 72.
So that's another thing. So this, just a question. When the National Register Association or whoever put out the National Association of Food Chains, this was it had to have been in the mid 60s for them, or the late 60s.
The late 60s, they started to worry about it.
Right.
And then they, and by the early 70s, 71,
That was
they
when
had
it-
decided we're going that way.
Right,
We
okay.
got to do it.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So now it became a question of each individual company doing their own thing, their own research, development, everything, applying for patents in the ways they were going to do it and all that.
Right.
So most of the patents at the time really were in the way of reading it, in the way of printing it. Remember, the barcode had to be printed on all kinds of products.
Right.
Really, to start with grocery products.
Cans. So cans would have a curved surface.
Cans had to have it. Some of the cans were aluminum cans that had a reflective surface.
And with ridges and everything that could
Correct, and
distort
even
them.
at that time, milk cartons had a wax coating on
right,
them.
because they were paper
So a
with wax.
barcode had to be there,
Right.
and so it was not a simple thing to do
Yeah.
at the time. Also, in the specifications, they had already specified that the product would kind of be wiped across a glass window with electronics and optics under it, so that it could read the code.
Right.
And that meant that it could read the code in any direction.
Right.
There was no,
So you didn't have to take
orientation
it
that
and
you
put
didn't
it
have to.
specifically on top.
Exactly. That would defeat the speed at which you could
There's
do
no
it.
way.
You just had to swipe it across the window, and it should read it. Okay. and read it with no errors.
Right.
Okay? And therefore, one of the stipulations was that, first of all, it had to be read in any direction.
Mm-hmm.
Second, it had to be read properly at a certain speed.
Right.
They had given us a maximum speed. You got to try it at that speed and it should read it at that
Right.
speed. Slower is fine, but what is the fastest speed that you can take it across?
Right.
And so all of that was established. And then there was also, when you read that, the computer system had to make sure that whatever you read was indeed right, because sometimes there could be a smudge on the barcode when it was printed or when
Right.
it was handled.
Or the wax on the milk carton could skew the
exactly.
bar or something,
Right.
and it still
All
had to
of
be
that.
able to read. Yeah.
So that was quite a task,
Mm-hmm.
because at that time, the optic, the lasers were available at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and the laser played a very important part in this, because the laser is the one that was going to illuminate your code
Right.
as it was being read by a photoelectric, at that time. The first one was actually a vacuum tube photoelectric cell,
Right.
as it's called. And so that, all of that was, and now how do you read that in so many directions? Okay, so you had to scan it in multiple directions as the product went by, and one of the directions would be in the right line. It would be aligned properly to
With
read
bars.
the full code. And on top of that, one of the specifications was, and some of those specifications were really kind of involved with our own, our own system for to make sure it is really foolproof and it's really reliable.
Right. Right.
So one of the things we had established at the time was that it could be as high as 200 scans. Of those 200, at least 7 scans had to all agree to say, okay, that is a legitimate string of numbers.
Right. Okay. At
Okay.
least 7
At least 7.
out
had
of
to
200.
agree. Okay. If there was only 6, it was considered not a good read and therefore rejected,
Yeah.
and so you had to scan it again.
Sure. Yeah.
So those were some of the intricacies and details as to what went on there.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's where the whole thing, and in our case, as I said, I was vice president of engineering, and I had about 106 people working under me. And some of them, there was a core of engineers who did, some of them did the mechanical end of it, some of them did the electronic end of it, like the cash register electronics and so on. And there was, of course, quite a lot of effort in the software.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay. And the computer at that time, the computer was based, the system was based on on a DEC computer, Digital Equipment Corporation computer. And if I remember right, it was the PDP-45. Okay, that was the computer used for it. And the bulk of the software was done by one of my engineers. His name was Wally Kirshner.
Wally Kirshner.
And he later on became director at Pitney Bowes,
Okay.
of electronics and so on. Anyway, and the overall head of the software business was Jim Walker. And in the mechanical end of it, there was Jim Mercura, who did the printing part of it, and printers and things like that. So there were quite a few, I'm just mentioning a few names here.
Sure. But there was a whole team.
And there was a big team that did, and so I just want to make sure it was not just, it was a team effort.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
and the team was really, our morale was way up there, and we were going to do it, and so on. So So that, at that point, at the other end of it, what the grocery chain, the association, what they were also working on was when all of this was done and ready to be tested, how do you test and how do you decide whose system is the best?
Of course, yeah.
Okay? Because it was a very big, very high level thing because the others would lose their money. So it had to be by somebody of real authority
Right,
to decide, okay, this is the one that's the winner.
right.
And so what they did is they hired Battelle Memorial Institute of Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, and very prestigious company, research company, very independent, and so that's what they were the ones who would be the arbiters of this whole thing. And once they made a decision, it would be pretty much final on behalf of the grocery association.
Okay.
So this is where the whole system or the approach was, okay? Now, when it comes to the intricacies and difficulties of the system, one of the biggest difficulties was just to print the barcode,
Right.
okay? Printing, not only just on paper, but on all these different surfaces that we talked about, okay? And mind you, when you print a bar, there can be an ink spread, depending on how you ink the stamping machine, if
Right.
you will. And if there was too much ink, the bar would spread.
Right.
So there was always the difficulty of a thin bar growing to a point where errors would be introduced because it started as a skinny bar, which would be a 0, and it kind of approached a 1 because
Turned
it was
into a fat bar.
right.
Right.
And so, as we were reading these things, we started to get a whole bunch of errors based on that because we were reading bar space, bar space, bar space. So we were coming up with many ideas as to how to read this. And now, when you read a bar with an electronic beam, what you're really doing is you're looking at the edges, and with a start edge and an ending edge of a bar,
Right.
and that's how you calculate how wide it is.
Right.
And the same thing with the space. So one of the patents, I have about 3 patents in it, and one of the readings of that was, we said, hey, why not, when we read a bar, space, bar, and space, and we go that way, you have the problem of this expanding bars or contracting bars.
Right, depending on your
And
surface
errors
and the
quite
ink
big.
and all of that, yeah.
So why don't we do just the black bars by themselves as a group, compare them against each other, and use the spaces. Remember, when a bar expands, the space gets smaller.
Of course, yeah, so then your white bars also get
Yeah.
skewed.
So we'll separate the black bars, and we'll separate the white bars, and then handle them as 2 separate groups, and decide which is wider and which is smaller, ones and zeros. That way, because the ink has proportionately made it larger on the black bars, and proportionately made it smaller on the white bars. But if you handle them by themselves,
Then
the error rate drops down dramatically.
it's yeah.
So that was one of our, IBM, at the time we didn't know this, but later on it became evident that IBM used what is called so what we did, getting back to the way we did it, we would measure each bar, bar, space, 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 by going to the start and the finish edges and calculating how wide it was. And then we went to the next one and so on. What IBM did was they did it by what is called the delta distance method.
Yes.
In other words, what they did is they started at the very first bar and the first edge, and they went across that first bar, and they calculated how wide it was. And for the second one, they still started at the same 0, and went to the other edge, and so each distance, the computer calculated, and it could tell how wide the thing was.
Right. Consistently.
Okay. And this is interesting because I'll get to that much later on. So anyway, so the system consisted of everything that the grocery store wanted, which was a cash register, which worked just like a regular cash register, except that it was all electronic. In other words, you could punch in numbers. It also had a reading part, which ended at the end of the conveyor. And at the end of the conveyor, a person could take a product and just swipe it across a glass window,
Right.
under which was the laser scanners, and then just drop it there. And when it went across, the machine, the system, read the numbers, and it translated it into the cash register, and it showed you what the number was and
the
its
price.
price, all of that.
Product. And we're back. Okay. So, we just ended at the universal product code is what they were going to call.
Yeah, so,
Yes.
so what the Grocery Association decided is that they would make it so available to everybody in the future that they called it the Universal Product Code, meaning that it was not just good for grocery stores
Right.
and grocery products. It would be useful way beyond that for other products and other ways of using it.
To
and all
use
of
to
that.
on
Okay.
trains or on baggage or
Correct.
scanning if you're a patient in the hospital and yeah.
Right. So, and at that point, I think each one of these outfits, they were all busy working and developing their own system, highly confidential, each one, because we didn't know who was going to win.
Right. Now,
Yeah.
did you guys even know who you were up against? Did you know that you would be?
At that time, we kind of vaguely knew, yes.
So you,
Like we knew with IBM was
Of
there,
course.
National Cash Register was there,
Oh, okay.
and so on.
Okay.
Yes, we did.
Okay.
But other than that, we did not know
Sure.
what they were doing, because each one was highly confidential, and also each one was, they were all, you know, applying for patents and so on.
Right.
Okay? And I think at this point, even though I repeated it before, I can mention it again, that they had stipulated right at the beginning that the patents would not run for 17 years. They would run only for 10.
Right.
Okay, and we had to agree to that. And the reason being that they really wanted this to be published to the whole world,
Sure.
that everybody could use it. And by the same token, that the system was strong enough for others to use it for other devices and other reasons. Okay. So, so that's how big this whole thing was and how far ahead they were looking at. Okay. So, so essentially, the system consisted of a cash register, a conveyor where the products were just like you have in the regular grocery store. And then at the end of the conveyor, I think I mentioned that before, there would be this window on which the product would be moved, and in any direction. There was no orientation or anything like that. You just moved it as long as it could see the barcodes, it could read it because it was scanning in multiple directions.
Right.
And one of them, within that time that it crossed the window, one of them would read that, and that one reading was really 200 scans or something like that. That's how fast the beam was moving.
Right. So, because when we look at it now, it almost looks like you almost see like a pattern.
Right.
And so, but you're saying we wouldn't even be able to see
No.
that.
What you see as a pattern, there's almost about 1,000 scans in there.
The eye
Yeah,
can't,
you cannot,
can't read that.
your eye cannot see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
But one of those scans will ultimately, in that split second of moving your can of peas
Right.
over the screen, one of those beams will pick up that bar.
Will
that, that
pick
linear code.
its scan will be such that it has traversed all the bars,
Right.
and therefore, but it's done it 200 times by then.
Mm-hmm.
And then of that, we wanted at least 7 scans to match to say, okay, that is a legit number.
Yeah.
If not, it would reject it.
Yeah.
Okay. And because of all those, you could have smudges on the barcode, fingerprints or dirt or all that kind of stuff. So that was the reason for it. And that made it very, very good. Okay. And also, as I mentioned before, the way we separated the bars and the spaces, and that was a very big improvement in the way we printed the whole bar, the codes themselves.
Right.
And so at this point, the system was so after the conveyor was the scanning window, and then of course the product was put in there. But also, all of this went into the computer, and the other side of it was that once you did it that way in the computer could now collect all that information for inventory purposes, for ordering, and all of that, so that if certain of 100 of one item went out, the computer knew that those 100 had to be reordered and so on. So it became a very big system.
Right.
And that's basically what they were looking for. They
Right.
were looking for the full system.
Right.
So that is when the period of development of that 1 year was over,
Right.
and Battelle was now going to test the whole thing.
Right.
Okay, and as I think I mentioned before, tremendous amount of security at Battelle Memorial Institute, and we were asked to go take our system, complete system, set it up there so that they could test it.
Right.
And they were experts. The Battelle is a highly known organization, a very independent organization that could be relied on for
Right.
all kinds of, and they could really judge which system and parts of systems were better than the other,
Sure.
and therefore they could make
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it would be accepted by
Right.
almost everybody.
Right.
And so that was done. So we were there, and of course, when ours was being tested, another one could be tested somewhere in the next room or so.
But
But
you
we
would
were
not.
not even armed guards and all that. We were not allowed to go.
Security must
Security
have
was
been through the
unbelievable.
roof.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, okay, so that is when all of this was all done, and we, the Battelle's testing was done.
How long was it between the time that Battelle did all of their testing and then they finally came to a decision? How was it? Was it
if I-
months, a year?
If I remember right, it was about 2 months.
Okay. Oh, that's okay. That's not too
Yeah,
bad.
yeah. And they were, because they were just testing it
Sure. Yeah.
based on complete working.
Sure.
There
Okay.
was none other thing other than to see how good it is.
Sure.
And they were subjecting it to different kinds of conditions, and can it do it at a certain speed?
Right.
And can it do it on a shiny surface like a
Right.
beer bottle, beer can, or things like that.
Right. Yeah.
So then they arranged this big meeting in San Francisco, where my boss, Norman Alpert, and I, as vice president of engineering, the two of us went to attend this thing. This is where they had all the CEOs of the big grocery chains
Mm-hmm.
inside a big, it was in a hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And we were outside, kind of waiting and pacing here and there. The smoke was all over.
Everybody was
Everybody
chain
was
smoking
chain
at that
smoking,
point.
and because everybody, each of these companies, including us, had spent the money, developed this whole thing,
Yeah.
and if you didn't get selected, you just lost all that
You're
money.
just out.
That's right, you're out of luck.
Yeah.
So finally, the doors opened, and they ushered us in. And the head of their technical group that tested it was presenting things too. And he started to tell us how they tested it and this and that, and we were anxious to say, come on, okay, but who's the winner? Who's the winner? That's
Right.
what we were
Right.
interested in.
Right.
Because a lot was writing on it.
Right.
And so finally they said, actually, there's no one winner, or there's no winner. So what does that mean? They said, well, in the same breath, he said, maybe we can call it two runner-ups. And the two runner-ups are IBM, we knew that, and Pitney Bowes. And I thought, oh, we still have a chance.
Right. Now, I can't remember if in the last segment, if we had talked about the errors, that with the 12, it was within 12,000 stands.
Yeah, I don't think we did. Well, let's
Okay.
repeat that anyway.
Okay, so let's
So-
we'll talk about that.
So when they said these are the two runner-ups, what do you mean by runner-up?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So basically, what they said is, we've taken the features of these two systems, and we've found that in certain ways this has a better feature and this one has a better feature in another area, and we took those and combined them, and that's what we made into the universal product code. And basically what they had, there was a lot of small things there that they did pick up here and there, which they incorporated, but predominantly there were two features, they said, that became very important to combine. And one was where, because of printing the barcode itself and the ink spreading, because when the ink spreads, the dark bars, black bars become wider, and the white bars get narrower,
Right.
and so it introduces a whole bunch of. This is where we had said Pitney Bowes' method was separate the bars and just count those and compare them for ones and zeros, and separate the whites or the white bars and make the comparison there, because the ink spreads proportionally.
Right.
And therefore these errors go proportionally, the width of the bar goes proportionally.
And we'll always read consistent.
And then when we had done that, the error came way down. So they said, from a printing point of view, and after all, the bars have to be printed. And therefore, so that was a very important feature, because you had to print it on all kinds of, cans and
Right, milk cartons with wax on them, and yeah.
The other one was, how does the computer compare the width of each bar or space, and then compare the size of each one to decide what's a 1 and what's a 0.
Right.
And that, so we just did that based on a linear, just going to the different edges and calculating it on that basis. IBM did it in a different way, where they said they're going to do it, in, as I mentioned before, delta distance
Right.
method, which is you start at the first edge and you call that 0, and you go to each edge
And count and,
and,
measure.
and you subtract the first one from the second one, and you get the width of the.
Right. That's
and so
it's brilliant.
And what was interesting was our error rate was 1 in 12 million. This is what we had predicted.
12 million.
No, I'm sorry, 12.
12,000?
1 in 12 million.
Million. Okay.
Not bad.
That's not bad.
Theirs was, their method, the delta distance method, was 1 in 14 million, which was even better. So they took that feature and the feature of the separating the spaces and bars, and they combined that to make the universal product code. And as I mentioned before, the patents on all of that ran only for 10 years.
Right.
And released to the whole country and world, for that matter.
Right.
And now and of course, you know, the whole the kernel of the idea. Now let me mention one other thing.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, this has to be said. The concept of using a rectangular bar,
Mm-hmm.
long bar,
Mm-hmm.
making it wider or smaller, and making the two as ones and zeros, being a narrow bar being a 0
Mm-hmm.
and a wide bar being a 1, and to use that as in the binary code for the computers.
Right.
That concept of using bars for just numbers,
Mm-hmm.
that goes back to the 1930s.
Right.
That's not anything new.
No.
The only thing is they did not have the wherewithal at that time, while the concept was nice, to use it for anything, because the rest of the stuff, the computers and all that, weren't even there.
Right.
There
Right.
was no way of using that. In fact, computers were non-existent at that point.
Right. Yeah.
But the concept was there. So the barcode itself, if you want to call it that,
Mm-hmm.
is pretty old.
Right. Yes.
But using that in a system is what the grocery people wanted.
Right.
And the system is a combination of all of this,
Right.
including the way to read it, how you read it, and how you decode it, all of that.
Right.
Okay. Now, later on, it became quite evident by, I think, that other gentleman that was on.
Yeah, we've been reading about George Lauer,
Right.
and he worked for IBM at the
right,
time, and he
and-
has a story.
And what they started to do is to use the numbers
Mm-hmm.
in a certain pattern and a certain code, where the first two numbers designated something, the next three numbers designated something else,
Right.
like this was for milk products or dairy products, and
Indeed,
this
yeah.
one was for different ways of using the numbers to code what the product was, so that
Right.
the computer would know what the product is. Is it a grocery product? Is it some other type of a product and all
Right.
that? That's what. But that is the method of using the barcode numbers in a certain pattern and certain way, where immediately the computer can designate or detect what kind of product it is.
Right.
That's a whole different, that came much later on.
Right.
And that's what the grocery store wanted, grocery
Right.
stores wanted.
So,
Identify products.
so you have 3 patents on in regards to the universal product code scanning.
Right, and my patents are in general, how do you detect the edges?
Right.
How do you use them to decipher them as numbers?
Right.
And then So that's basically most of my patents.
Right. So, and I'm looking at just one of them, and again, I'll include the numbers in my description of this video, so you guys can look it up if you want. But just the first one is data processing system employing particular barcode configuration, and that was filed in February 24th, 1971. So that's really right. Early on. That's
when it was.
I think a lot of other people out there, it is still being perfected, and as you were saying, it's
still evolving.
Now we've got the little square pixel for when we scan with our iPhones and our Androids.
Where they scramble the whole barcode.
You can't tell
anything. The computer knows how to unscramble it.
Exactly. So that's this. I've had lots of questions all my life, and really. For me, the reason I wanted to interview my dad and I wanted to put this out there first was because there are many stories out there. There are a lot of abbreviated stories. You find a lot about IBM out there. I think you find a little bit about Battelle Memorial, very little about Pitney Bowes, and certainly my dad's name has not come up so much when you do an online search, and so I wanted him to be able to tell his story. And for me particularly because it struck me finally when we were Target and Albertsons and all of our wonderful stores now started allowing the layman, the customer, to do the scanning. And it wasn't until it was a snowy evening and I needed to get home, and I went to that self-service line and I started scanning my products as fast as I could before the snow started to fly, and I stopped, and it hit me that the reason I was able to get home before the snow flew, and the reason it was so easy and so quick for me to get out of that line was because of my dad.
Yeah. Well, and also, some of those patents have other people's names. One was my boss, so that was Norman Alpert, who passed away some years ago. And also, I believe it's Robert Brewer, who was an amazing guy who could invent things, simple concepts, and yet it made such a big difference.
Right.
And of course, I think I mentioned the bulk of the software was done by Wally Kirshner, and the head of the software at that time in my department was Jim Walker. Right. And he later became director at National Cash Register, I think. Right. And Wally Kirshner became director of some electronics or something there in Pitney Bowes later on.
Right. I'm looking at another patent, a data processing system and reader, therefore, and that has Robert Burler, Norman Alpert of Scarsdale, New York, and Nanjandaya and Murthy. Right. So. And
also, one of the important parts of the thing that also has my name and in the patent was we needed at that time, because I remember this was in the early days of computers and things like that, where they needed a printer that would print through 7 copies or 7 what do you call it, the
carbon copies
at the time. As receipts. And so I had come up with an idea of making multiple hammers go on a rotating drum that had all the characters, the 26 characters of the alphabet, and numbers, of course. And so the hammers would be released at the proper time by the electronics, and it would strike the character or the number, and that's how the receipts were produced. Right. But there were 7 copies of it, okay, and you had to have the proper energy in that, and it was like triggering a gun. When you cock a gun and trigger it, that spring energy is imparted in it, and so that was another patent that I had,
we will we'll talk about that in another segment.
Right. Correct. Yeah.
Well, great. All right. Thanks, Dad.
Okay.
All right. If you have any questions, leave them on my page.